This video is an introduction to lipids. If you remember from the chart that we looked at in the biomolecules video, there's actually a few different parts to lipids that make them kind of unique as a biomolecule. Many of the other ones we had like the monomers listed in this category. And with lipids, it's not quite as simple as just a polymer group and a monomer group, because lipids are made up of two separate parts. There's this glycerol backbone, which makes this structural part of the lipid. And then there's the fatty acid chain that attaches to that. So this one has three fatty acid chains. Two of them are saturated, and then one of them is unsaturated. We'll get into that difference a little bit more in a minute. As far as the function goes for lipids, their main purpose is to store energy. So your body stores fats for energy. This is one way that you can sort of store energy if you're in a period of surplus, and then you can use that energy if you're in a period of time where you're not getting enough calories. One thing that's kind of interesting to talk about with this is that people obviously evolved long before there were supermarkets and a stable food supply. So a lot of the things now that we think of as like negative with gaining fat are actually a survival mechanism. There isn't always enough food around for early man. So this way storing fat is something that is good for your survival. So if you're going through a period of time where you have plenty of food, you could sort of fatten up and store that energy. And then if you go through a period of time where there isn't as much food, then you can use that energy and you'll still be able to survive. Now today, you live in America, there's usually plenty of food around. So the storage of fat and things like that, we tend to look at it as negative, but evolutionarily, you have to understand it's a survival mechanism. Another thing that it does that's positive for you is that it cushions and insulates your organs. This is good in low amounts. One of the things that I'll never forget, when I was at Millersville, we were doing dissections in my zoology class, and we dissected a mink. And minks are sort of like large rodents, and they eat a diet of mostly meat. So they are sort of fatty on the inside, and all of their organs were covered in this layer of fat, and they were literally almost greasy inside. And if you've ever known someone who needed surgery and they were told that they needed to lose weight first, like maybe they needed to lose 30 pounds or something like that before they could have an operation, this is why that's the case. It's because your body stores lipids around your organs, and it sort of coats the inside of your body. And sometimes someone can be like too heavy for a surgeon to operate optimally on them. And that just kind of has to do with where we're storing this stuff. But then the last one in this category is material used for the cell membrane. We talked about the phospholipid bilayer that's surrounding the outside of the cell. Obviously, it's made up of mostly lipids with those phosphate groups in there as well. The sources are pretty straightforward. We've got butter, so something that's obviously derived from dairy products, nuts for a lot of good, healthy, natural fats, and then oils sort of depends on what they are, but some of them have good, healthy options for us. Other things, like vegetable oil, is really not quite as good for you. But if we're looking at this image here, like some of the other topics we talked about, this doesn't represent strictly fats. Your oils and things pretty much will be, but something like bacon is going to have other things in it, like protein as well. So it's not always as straightforward as, hey, this is just a lipid, but these are all things that have lipids or fats in them. The next thing we have to talk about are fatty acids. Now, I mentioned this a little bit in the last diagram, saying that the lipid that was there had three different fatty acids. Two of them were saturated and one of them was unsaturated. In order to understand what that means, we have to talk about a little bit of chemistry. If you look at these molecules, all of the letters on here represent different elements. So we have oxygen, we have carbon, hydrogen, and the one we're going to focus on for now is carbon. Carbon's represented by the C's. Carbon is capable of sharing 4 bonds. Each of these bonds represents 2 electrons. So this carbon is sharing a pair of electrons with hydrogen, and these electrons are being passed back and forth. We call this a covalent bond. So they're sharing those electrons. The ideal number for elements is having 8 total electrons. So carbon has 2, 4, 6, 8 electrons in this formation. We call this one saturated because each of these carbons has the maximum number of hydrogens attached to it. So each carbon in this chain is attached to 2 hydrogens, and then 2 other carbons, except of course if it's this last one. The last one's attached to 1 other carbon and then 3 hydrogens. But it still works out the same way. It still has 2, 4, 6, 8 electrons that are being shared that are binding it to those things around it. If we look down at the unsaturated one, this carbon and this carbon share what's called a double bond, meaning they're actually sharing a group of electrons between the 2 of them. So this carbon still has 8 electrons. It has 2, 4, 6, and 8, because each of those, again, are representing 2 that they're basically sharing. When it comes to these types of fatty acids and what's good for your health, generally saturated fats are things that the body has a little bit of a harder time breaking down, and as a general rule, they're coming from animal products. So you'll get more saturated fat in something like beef, and then more of the unsaturated fats in natural sources like things like olive oil and things like that. Now there are still saturated fats in olive oil, but there's just more of what they call the healthy fats or the unsaturated fats. So the only real difference with these, again, is the number of bonds that carbon's making. And technically, I suppose it's still the same number, but some of them are double bonds, whereas all of these are single bonds. And it just changes the molecular structure a little bit. Something to keep in mind, if you remember back to that first picture, a individual lipid can actually have multiple chains of fatty acids that are attached to that glycerol group. So they can have some that are saturated and then some that are unsaturated attached to the same lipid. The main thing to understand with these are just the differences between the saturated and unsaturated fats. Of course, you want to make sure that you know some different sources for these, like going back to that picture on the first page, and then of course some of the uses and functions for lipids in the body. So if you're comfortable with those things, you'll be pretty much all set with this video. Make sure you take the time to answer the questions when it's over. Thank you.